The midnight of absolute resolve, January 3, 2026, 2 o'clock hours, Caracas, Venezuela. The humidity in Caracas usually clung to the skin like a wet shroud. But tonight, the air felt strangely electrified, brittle with an unspoken tension that had been building since Christmas. For months, the rumors had swirled through the barrios and the gilded enclaves of the enchufados alike. They whispered of the Black Fleet sitting just beyond the horizon in the Caribbean, the USS Iwo Jima and its escorts, dark shapes that had spent the autumn of 2025 turning drug runners into fireballs under the banner of Operation Southern. Spear. In the Miraflores Palace, the mood was one of performative defiance. President Nicolás Maduro, the man who had survived coup attempts, drone strikes, and hyperinflation, was awake. He was often awake at this hour, watching the encrypted feeds from his generals, surrounded by the thinning circle of loyalists who hadn't yet been bought off by the CIA's quiet, suffocating pressure campaign. Just 2 days prior, Maduro had danced on national television. He had mocked the gringo emperor in Washington, doing a clumsy imitation of Donald Trump's fist pump dance while salsa music blared. No war, yes peace, he had shouted to a crowd of Boston students. But the dance was a frantic signal, a desperate semaphore to a world that was no longer watching with sympathy. The old order of Latin America, the unspoken pact of sovereignty, the respectful distance of the post-Cold War era, the diplomatic shielding provided by Brazil and Mexico, was about to evaporate in the span of 150 minutes. At 2:14 a.m., the city's power grid flickered. This was not unusual in Caracas, where blackouts were a daily penance. But this time, the darkness was absolute. The backup generators at Miraflores hesitated, then engaged, bathing the complex in a sterile, emergency red. High above, invisible to the Russian-made S-300 radar systems that had been mysteriously blinded by a massive cyber incursion moments earlier, the sky was tearing open. Operation Absolute Resolve had begun. It wasn't the clumsy, Bay of Pigs-style beach landing the regime had spent years preparing for. It wasn't a mercenary incursions like the failed Operation Gideon of 2020. This was the full, unrestrained weight of the United States military machine, unleashed by a president who had decided that the Monroe Doctrine was too soft and had replaced it with what his advisors were calling the Trump corollary. The first sign of the end was soundless. MH-6 Little Bird helicopters, modified for ultra-quiet flight, skimmed the rooftops of the Libertador municipality. They carried operators from the Army's 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Simultaneously, from the darkened Caribbean waters, B-22 Ospreys roared inland, carrying the extraction teams inside Miraflores. The confusion was total. The Presidential Guard, the Casa Militar, found their communications dead. Their radios hissed static. Their cell phones showed no signal. The only sound was the sudden, shattering boom of breach charges blowing the heavy mahogany doors of the residential wing off their hinges. The raid was surgical, violent, and terrifyingly fast. There was no negotiation. The operators moved through the palace with the fluidity of water, dropping flashbangs that turned the ornate hallways into blinding corridors of white light and deafening noise. The resistance from the guards was sporadic and panicked. They were fighting ghosts who saw everything through quad-tube night vision goggles. By 2:45 a.m., it was over. Nicolás Maduro was found in his private quarters, not defiant, but stunned. He was dressed in a tracksuit, the uniform of his comfortable authoritarianism. Beside him was his wife, Silva Flores. There were no cameras to record the moment, no live stream for the world to critique, just the harsh commands of American operators, the zip ties, and the black hoods. They were hustled out to the courtyard where a modified MH-47 Chinook waited, its rotors churning the tropical air into a frenzy as the helicopter lifted off, banking hard toward the coast. The city of Caracas remained in darkness, sleeping through the moment its history broke into 6 a.m. Washington, D.C. The sun had not yet risen over the Potomac when the press briefing was announced. It was hasty, unexpected. The White House press corps, bleary-eyed and clutching coffees, scrambled into the briefing room. But it wasn't the press secretary who walked out. It was President Trump himself. He looked energized, feeding off the chaos he knew he was about to unleash. "My fellow Americans," he began, foregoing the teleprompter for the raw, direct delivery that was his trademark. "For too long, we have watched a criminal cartel masquerade as a government in our own backyard. They poisoned our people with drugs. They stole the future of the Venezuelan people, and they thought they were untouchable. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the room. Last night, under my orders, United States forces conducted a precision operation in Caracas. We have captured Nicolás Maduro. We have captured his wife. They are currently on the USS Iwo Jima, and they are heading to New York to face justice for narco-terrorism. The reign of the cartel is over. The room erupted. Shout, questions, flashes. Trump ignored them, leaning into the microphone. We are in charge now until we can ensure a safe transition. The oil they stole, we're taking it back to pay for the damage they did. The Monroe Doctrine is back, folks, and it's bigger than ever. The shockwave news hit Latin America like a physical blow. The old order, that delicate diplomatic ecosystem, where sovereignty was the highest religion, shattered instantly. In Brasilia, the foreign ministry was in paralysis. For decades, Brazil had operated under the principle of non-intervention. They had tolerated Maduro, negotiated with him, and shielded him from the worst of U.S. excesses in the name of regional stability. Now, the U.S. had simply reached in and plucked a head of state from his palace, if they could do it to Maduro, who was safe in Mexico City. The president called an emergency cabinet meeting. The pink-tide leaders who had sympathized with Venezuela's struggle against imperialism found their rhetoric suddenly hollow against the reality of Delta Force boots on the ground. The U.S. was no longer playing by the rules of international norms or UN resolutions. This was raw power politics. The reaction in Caracas, as the sun finally rose, was a strange, terrifying silence. There were no mass protests yet. The PSUV party structure was decapitated. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, hiding in a bunker, tweeted a demand for proof of life. But the tweet felt small, pathetic against the magnitude of the event. The colectivos, the armed gangs loyal to the regime, stayed off the streets, unsure who to shoot, terrified that a Hellfire missile might be the response to a raised rifle. The old order relied on the assumption that the costs of invasion were too high for Washington. It relied on the idea that Latin America was a complex web of alliances that had to be massaged, not smashed. Trump had proven that assumption wrong in 2 hours and 30 minutes. As the USS Iwo Jima steamed north, carrying the most valuable prisoner in the Western Hemisphere, the geopolitical map of the Americas was being redrawn. The era of diplomatic niceties was dead. The era of the Monroe Doctrine had arrived, and its first lesson was brutal. Sovereignty is a privilege, not a right, and it can be revoked at midnight. But as the initial shock wore off, the questions began to bubble up from the wreckage. What happens to a country of 30 million people when the government disappears overnight? Who runs the oil fields? And most dangerously, how will China and Russia, who had billions invested in the survival of the Maduro regime, respond to having their assets seized by an American president looking for a payout? The vacuum and the vulturous. January 4, 2026, 9 o'clock hours, Caracas, Venezuela. The morning after the raid, Caracas did not wake up. It simply realized it had never gone to sleep. The sun beat down on a city that had been hollowed out. The old order of the PSUV United Socialist Party of Venezuela had evaporated overnight, leaving behind a terrifying silence. There were no police on the streets. The National Guard, usually ubiquitous at every intersection, had vanished into their barracks, waiting to see which way the wind would blow, or more accurately, who would sign their next paycheck. In the barrios of Pitar, the silence was broken only by the sound of breaking glass. The colectivos, the motorcycle-riding paramilitaries, who had served as the regime's enforcers, were in disarray. Their patrons were either in U.S. custody or fleeing toward the Colombian border. Without orders, and more importantly, without funding, they turned on the city. Looting began at the Excelsior Gama supermarket in Santa Edviges and spread like wildfire. But this wasn't the hunger-driven looting of 2017. This was the looting of a population that knew there were no longer any consequences. In the emptiness of the Miraflores Palace, a bizarre scene was playing out. Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, had emerged from her bunker to find herself the nominal head of a state that no longer existed. She sat in the Situation Room, surrounded by 3 terrified aides and a bank of phones that wouldn't stop ringing. On one line was the Chinese ambassador, Qiu Shaoqi, demanding assurances for the safety of China's $60 billion in infrastructure loans. On another was a frantic Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, who was currently besieged in Fuerte Tiuna by junior officers, demanding they surrender to the Americans before the Black Fleet launched another strike. And on the third line, holding for the last 20 minutes, was the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. When she finally picked up, Rubio's voice was cold, stripped of diplomatic gloss. "Madam Vice President," he said, using her title with a sarcasm that cut through the static, "you have two choices. You can be the interim administrator who facilitates the transition and retires to a villa in Turkey, or you can be the second defendant in the Southern District of New York. You have 1 hour." January 5, 2026, the Orinoco Belt, well, Caracas, ate itself. The real objective of Operation Absolute Resolve was being secured 300 miles to the southeast. They didn't wear U.S. Army patches. They wore the nondescript fatigues of private military contractors, former SEALs, and Rangers on the payroll of a newly formed subsidiary of a major American energy conglomerate. They arrived in unmarked Cessnas at the dilapidated airstrips of the Orinoco oil belt. Their mission was not peacekeeping. It was asset seizure. For years, the PDVSA State Oil Company facilities here had been run by a patchwork of Russian engineers, from Rosneft and Chinese technicians from CNPC. They kept the heavy crude flowing just enough to pay the interest on Venezuela's massive debts. At the Petromonagas facility, the confrontation was tense but bloodless. A team of 20 American contractors rolled up to the main gate in Toyota Hiluxes. The Russian security detail, a group of bored Wagner Group veterans, looked at the Americans, then at their own rusted AK-47s, and then back at the Americans. "The rent is overdue," the American team leader shouted in broken Spanish, "and the landlord is here." The Russians, pragmatic to a fault, didn't shoot. They negotiated a ride to the coast. By noon, the American flag wasn't flying over the oil field. That would be bad optics, but the PDVSA flag had been lowered. In its place, nothing flew. The oil was no longer Venezuelan. It was now distressed collateral. The geopolitical shockwaves in Beijing. The reaction was apoplectic. An emergency session of the Politburo Standing Committee was called. President Xi Jinping viewed the raid not just as an attack on a partner, but as a direct assault on the Belt and Road Initiative. Venezuela was China's energy insurance policy, a strategic foothold in America's backyard. Now, Trump was threatening to liquidate it. "This is piracy," the foreign ministry spokesperson declared in a briefing that was live-streamed globally. "The United States has engaged in an act of armed aggression that violates every norm of the United Nations Charter. We reserve the right to take all necessary measures to protect our assets." But the threat rang hollow. China's navy, formidable as it was, could not project power into the Caribbean to challenge the U.S. Second Fleet. Beijing's response would be asymmetric: a sudden, massive sell-off of U.S. Treasury bonds and a cyber offensive targeting the U.S. power grid. The invisible war had begun, a digital retaliation for a physical invasion. In Brasilia, President Lula was ashen-faced. He stood before the press at the Planalto Palace, flanked by Colombia's Gustavo Petro. The old order of Latin American solidarity, the idea that the region could solve its own problems, was dead. "They didn't just kidnap a president," Lula said, his voice trembling with genuine anger. "They kidnapped the sovereignty of an entire continent. If Washington can decide who rules in Caracas, they can decide who rules in Brasilia, or Bogotá, or Santiago." The OAS, Organization of American States, convened an emergency meeting, but the room was split. The right-leaning governments of Argentina and El Salvador quietly applauded the removal of the socialist cancer. The left-leaning bloc screamed about imperialism. The organization, effectively paralyzed, ceased to function as a relevant body. The New York spectacle back in the United States, the media cycle was in overdrive. The arrival of Nicolás Maduro in New York was treated not like a diplomatic crisis, but like a Super Bowl halftime show. Footage of Maduro, wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackled at the waist, being led off a Gulfstream jet at LaGuardia Airport, played on a loop in Times Square. The narco-terrorism indictment was unsealed by Attorney General Pamela Bondi, reading out charges that sounded like the plot of a Sicario movie: conspiracy to flood the U.S. with cocaine, collaboration with the FARC, weaponizing migration. Trump, calling into Fox News, was jubilant. "We're going to take the oil, folks. We're going to take it, sell it, and pay back every American family for the cost of the migration crisis this man caused. It's called restitution." It was a popular message. Polls showed 65% of Americans supported the raid and recovery strategy. The legal and moral complexities were drowned out by the sheer spectacle of victory. The cliffhanger bit as night fell on January 5th. The initial paralysis in Venezuela began to thaw into something more dangerous. In the dense, lawless jungles of the border region with Colombia, the 10th Front of the FARC dissidents and the young guerrillas who had enjoyed safe haven under Maduro realized their sanctuary was gone. They were heavily armed, battle-hardened, and had nothing to lose, and in the slums of Caracas, a new rumor was spreading. It wasn't about the Americans. It was about a shipment of Manpad's shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles that had gone missing from a military stockpile in Maracay just before the surrender. The U.S. had decapitated the head of the snake, but the body was still writhing, and it was beginning to grow new, venomous heads. The raid was over. The occupation and the insurgency was about to begin. The quagmire, the exodus, and the new order. February 2026, the end of the honeymoon of Operation Absolute Resolve lasted exactly 40 days. For the first month, the sheer shock of the decapitation strike kept the streets quiet. But shock is a perishable commodity. By mid-February, the paralysis had thawed, replaced by a simmering, opportunistic rage and a tactical shift by the scattered regime elements. The first major crack in the illusion of control appeared on February 12th, on the Caracas-La Guaira highway. A convoy belonging to Orinoco Logistics, a Texas-based contractor carrying drilling equipment, was moving through what was designated a secure corridor. The attack didn't come from a tank. It came from a drainpipe, an IED packed with nails, and looted C4 flipped the lead armored SUV like a toy. Before the dust settled, automatic fire erupted from the shanty towns clinging to the mountainside. The attackers were chamos from local gangs, paid in cash by FARC handlers now operating out of safe houses in the capital. The message was clear. The Americans might own the sky, but they did not own the road. Dollarization at gunpoint, and the rust war while the military situation deteriorated into ambushes. The economic reality became a humanitarian catastrophe. President Trump's restitution plan hinged on a brutal shock therapy. Dollarization at gunpoint. The U.S. Provisional Authority declared the bolivar void, making the U.S. dollar the only legal tender. It stopped hyperinflation instantly because there was no money left to print, but it created a medieval stratification of society. Caracas became two cities. In the east, fortified green zones emerged where contractors and returning exiles drank $8 lattes behind blast walls guarded by private mercenaries. But crossed the highway into the west, and you entered the dead zone. For the millions of pensioners, civil servants, and poor whose life savings in bolivars had evaporated overnight, life became slow starvation. The U.S. Provisional Authority, overwhelmed, began issuing biometric ration cards. The lines for a bag of rice stretched for blocks. Simultaneously, the centerpiece of the entire operation, the oil, was turning into a disaster. In Washington, President Trump was furious. He had promised that Venezuelan oil would pay for the operation. Why isn't it pumping? He demanded of his energy advisors. The reality on the ground in the Orinoco Belt was grim. The infrastructure wasn't just broken, it had been cannibalized. Departing Russian engineers had stripped copper wiring. Pipelines were rusted through. When American crews tried to pressurize them, they burst. Instead of money flowing out, billions of taxpayer dollars were flowing in just to secure the fields and patch the rot. The Trump corollary was bleeding red ink. The invisible warships tactics while the Americans struggled with rust and logistics. Their enemies adapted. Russia and China, shut out of the oil, moved the war to the shadows, flooding the black market with high-tech weaponry. On March 15th, the insurgency changed the rules of engagement. A civilian contractor helicopter, an old Bell 412 ferrying VIPs to Maracaibo, was struck by an IGLAS Manpad's shoulder-fired missile just after takeoff. There were no survivors. The attack grounded all civilian flights and spiked insurance rates by 500%. The cost of doing business became unsustainable. The insurgency wasn't trying to win territory. They were making the occupation too expensive and bloody to sustain. By April, the mood in Washington had shifted. The midterm elections were approaching in November, and the nightly news was a steady drip of ambushes and famine riots. Trump needed an exit strategy, but he couldn't leave a vacuum. The Great March, weaponizing migration as the rainy season, slowed U.S. operations. The surviving leadership of the PSUV, ELN commanders, and disaffected military factions met secretly in Havana. They realized they couldn't defeat the U.S. military head-on. Instead, they planned to weaponize the one thing Washington feared more than communism: people. On June 15th, the Great March began. It wasn't a ragged trickle of refugees. It was industrialized migration. Convoys of commandeered buses, funded by dark money, ferried tens of thousands to the Colombian border, where well-paid traffickers funneled them north with terrifying efficiency. The message whispered to every migrant was simple. The gringos broke it. Go to their house and make them fix it. By late June, 30,000 people a day were arriving at the U.S. southern border. The optics were catastrophic. Fox News was now running split screens. U.S. troops bogged down in Venezuelan mud, and the Rio Grande overwhelmed by the very people those troops were supposed to be saving. The cynical end can be July 4th. The political fallout in Washington was radioactive. The generals informed Trump that holding the population was impossible and costing billions a month. Trump, staring at disaster in the upcoming midterms, snapped, "Get me a deal," he ordered. "Find me a general down there who looks the part, can turn off the spigot, and let us declare victory and leave." The solution was brutal realpolitik. The U.S. found General Hector Silva, a former Chavista officer with no ideology other than survival, who promised to crush the gangs and protect the oil infrastructure. The Treaty of Miami was signed in August in a Florida hotel conference room. The terms were simple. U.S. combat troops would withdraw by October 1st, just in time for the elections. American companies retained exclusive 99-year rights to the oil fields, with revenue going into an escrow account controlled by the U.S. Treasury. In exchange, General Silva would head the Provisional Council of Order. There would be no elections. For 5 years, to save Venezuela from a dictatorship, the U.S. installed a more efficient, corporate-friendly one. The zombie-stative last American C-17 lifted off from Maiquetía Airport at sunset on October 1st, 2026. There were no cheering crowds down below. General Silva's new security forces armed with American M4S instead of Russian AIKs were already setting up checkpoints. The purge began that night, targeting the troublemakers, union leaders, student protesters, and the idealists who had foolishly believed the American promises of democracy. By January 2027, 1 year after the raid, the dust had settled on a colder, harder reality. Venezuela was no longer a sovereign nation, but a zombie state, a resource colony with a flag, its oil flowing north, its people remaining poor, and its government answering to a desk at the U.S. State Department. The Trump raid hadn't saved Latin America. It had broken its spirit. Trust died, replaced by a frantic arms race among neighbors like Brazil and Colombia, who realized international law was a fairy tale. China and Russia remained in the shadows, playing a new, silent Cold War. In a muddy street in Pitar, Caracas, a young boy watched a convoy of American oil trucks rumble past. Guarded by Silva's masked men, he picked up a piece of chalk and wrote, on a wall next to fading anti-American graffiti, capturing the truth of the new era, "Cambio todo, para que nada cambie."